Welcome to this explainer. Right out of the gate, I want you to imagine taking an entire civilization, all of its resources, its labor, its vast ambitions, and trying to turn the whole thing into one giant spreadsheet. And we're talking decades before modern computers could realistically handle it. We are looking at millions of people and thousands of factories being coordinated entirely by pencil, paper, and human arithmetic. Today, we're going to explore one of the absolute largest and most audacious economic experiments in modern history. We are asking a really fundamental, sweeping question here. How did the USSR actually decide what to produce, where it should go, and who should get it? So, how do you actually run a massive, nationwide economy without any market prices to guide you? Well, the truth is, it wasn't just random chaos. It was a highly organized, deeply structured system with monumental strengths, but also some fatal weaknesses built directly into its method of coordination. The positive ambition behind this was, honestly, incredibly grand. The goal was to just eliminate the chaotic, competing interest of capitalism entirely, and instead treat the whole economy like a single, perfectly rational machine working exclusively for the public good. They wanted to take resources and direct them straight toward rapid industrialization, full employment, guaranteed housing, universal education, and national development. But to pull off that utopian ambition, they had to deliberately do away with decentralized markets. Instead, the Soviet state attempted something that sounds almost impossible to us today, manually calculating the inputs and outputs of a whole society. Think about it. Every single physical tractor, every newly poured apartment building, every pair of winter shoes, and literally every loaf of bread had to be converted into raw data on a staggering scale. It was essentially a giant planning map. Millions of variables had to be actively coordinated from the top down, relying on massive armies of clerks instead of servers and algorithms. To figure out how this actually worked in practice, we're going to break the system down across 6 clear areas: rejecting markets for spreadsheets, the machinery of Gosplan, balancing inputs and outputs, the problem with fixed prices, surviving the quota system, and finally, the legacy of the command economy. Let's dive right into part 1, rejecting markets for spreadsheets. Now, back in the 1920s, there was actually a pragmatic, hybrid mix of state and market mechanisms operating under Lenin's new economic policy. Farmers could sell their surplus grain, and small businesses were allowed to exist. But this hybrid era didn't last long. Driven by an intense fear of external threats, especially a major war scare in 1927, and a really burning desire to rapidly modernize what was still a very agrarian society, Joseph Stalin abruptly pivoted the country. He launched the first 5-year plan in 1928, and the new mandate was rapid, forced industrialization at absolutely any cost. This pivot brought profound and violent structural changes, like the forced collectivization of agriculture. The human cost here was absolutely devastating, unleashing the horrors of the Holodomor famine, where millions tragically perished, as the state violently seized total control of the economic steering wheel. Their early economic priorities were crystal clear and completely uncompromising. A massive 78% of industrial investment during that first plan was funneled directly into heavy industry. We're talking coal, steel, cement, massive machine tools. And the logic was pure survival. You simply cannot fight a potential war with extra leather shoes or comfortable furniture. You need tanks, you need railways, and you need steel. The goal was to build a mechanized, autonomous superpower that could defend itself. But of course, this required severe sacrifices. It meant that light industry and everyday consumer needs were deliberately left behind. The factory was officially prioritized over the living room. All right, moving on to part 2, the machinery of Gosplan. To actually coordinate a continent-spanning empire without a market, the state had to build a massive administrative hierarchy, and sitting right at the very top of this pyramid was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Gosplan was the ultimate architect of the Soviet economy. Picture their headquarters in Moscow for a second. Thousands of clerks, endless rows of typewriters, telephones constantly ringing, and just absolute mountains of paperwork. Their monumental job was to take the broad, high-level political goals of the leadership and translate them into detailed operational blueprints for the entire nation. So if the political leaders said, "We need to double steel production in 5 years," the clerks at Gosplan had to sit down and mathematically figure out exactly how many extra workers, how much raw coal, and how many new train cars were needed to actually make that a reality. The sheer scale of this task is just hard to overstate. By 1973, Gosplan planners were centrally working out the supply balances for 1,943 of the economy's most important material items. Now, to really put that into perspective, a single modern neighborhood supermarket carries over 30,000 unique items. Gosplan was trying to steer an entire global superpower by manually tracking just a couple thousand highly simplified categories. It really reveals the brutal oversimplification that was absolutely required just to make the math work out on paper. They executed all of this through a strict chain of command known as the up and down procedure. First, Gosplan would send broad control figures down to the various economic ministries. Then, the individual factory managers would review these targets and send counterproposals back up. And this created a massive, perpetual bureaucratic tug-of-war. Think about the incentives here. Gosplan wanted maximum output using the minimum amount of resources, but the factory managers, who were terrified of missing their quotas, wanted the lowest possible output targets along with a huge surplus of resources just to be safe. After an exhausting bargaining process, a finalized quota was issued for every single enterprise, and at that point, the plan literally became the law.
Which brings us to part 3, balancing inputs and outputs.
To make all this work, planners relied heavily on the material balance method, which was essentially a giant physical ledger. They attempted to perfectly match all the sources of supply across the nation with all the sources of demand. But the fatal catch here was that they did this using natural physical units, tons of coal, meters of cloth, instead of money. It was an incredibly rigid system. Think about it. In a market economy, if a coal train derails, the price of coal goes up, and factories naturally adapt by conserving it or maybe switching fuels. But in this system, there was no dynamic price adjustment at all. A single derailed train meant the physical balances for entire downstream industries were just completely ruined for the year. As you can guess, manually coordinating millions of interacting variables caused massive chronic bottlenecks. By the 1960s, these inefficiencies were just impossible to ignore. Prominent economists like Avsay Lieberman and Premier Alexei Kosygin pushed for the 1965 economic reforms. They wanted to shift the focus away from merely hitting sheer output targets measured in physical weight and instead try to reintroduce profitability and sales as success indicators. They desperately wanted factory managers to care whether the goods they manufactured were actually useful to society rather than just checking a box on a quota sheet. But unfortunately, these reforms ultimately fell flat, because you simply cannot tell a manager to maximize profit if the state is still artificially inventing all the prices. And that leads us perfectly into part 4, the problem with fixed prices. This is a fundamental challenge at the very heart of the command economy. In a capitalist market, prices fluctuate dynamically. If a new style of shoe is suddenly popular, its price naturally rises, immediately signaling manufacturers to step up production. Soviet administrative prices were entirely different. They were fixed by the state, sometimes remaining absolutely identical for a decade at a time. The price of a cooking pot or a pair of leather shoes was often physically stamped right into the metal or the leather at the factory. It couldn't change because it was permanently etched into the product. Prices acted purely as a bureaucratic accounting tool, not as an active, breathing signal of what consumers actually desired or what materials were genuinely scarce. This lack of flexibility created a devastating domino effect throughout everyday life. Because there was no market-clearing mechanism, any slight planning error, say a minor underestimation of the demand for bread or a brief delay in delivering leather, immediately translated into severe physical shortages. Since prices weren't allowed to naturally rise to balance supply and demand, people paid with their time instead. This is exactly what birthed the endless, exhausting queues for daily necessities that the Soviet era became so famous for. And in a cruel twist of irony, citizens would spend hours waiting in the freezing cold for basic bread, sometimes right down the street from massive warehouses overflowing with thousands of outdated, obsolete tractors that continued to be produced simply because the 5-year plan demanded it. Okay, part 5, surviving the quota system. When an artificial dashboard of official numbers constantly clashes with on-the-ground reality, well, human nature takes over. This generated what economists call systemic pathologies. Since managers were rewarded strictly for hitting gross output targets, they adapted creatively and, honestly, often absurdly. There's a famous historical joke that perfectly captures this. If a nail factory was given a quota measured strictly in weight, they would produce one giant 500-ton nail. If they were given a quota measured in quantity, they would produce 1 million microscopic, completely useless pins. In reality, this meant things like pointlessly heavy chandeliers or dangerously thick glass. Managers hoarded raw materials just in case. They engaged in storming, frantically rushing production at the very end of the month, which absolutely ruined product quality. And they frequently relied on prepiski, meaning they blatantly submitted fictitious, inflated output data just to keep the higher-ups happy and avoid punishment. These systemic flaws resulted in massively overstretched, or taut, plans. For instance, during the first five-year plan, the political target for steel production was an incredibly ambitious 10 million tons, but actual physical production barely scraped 5.9 million. When aggressive, mathematically unfeasible targets like these were predictably missed, it caused vicious, cascading failures downstream in the supply chain. If the steel wasn't there, the tractor plant just sat idle. If the tractors weren't built, the autumn harvest couldn't be collected. It was a brutal chain reaction.
Finally, Part 6, Legacy of the Command Economy.
Over the decades, a massive duality emerged in Soviet society. Above ground, you had the official economy of rigid bureaucratic compliance, where the statistics often looked fantastic and heroic on paper. But thriving right underneath it was the second economy. This was a vast, unofficial, and often entirely illegal network of black markets, barter, and a complex system of personal favors known as blot. And here is the ultimate profound irony of the entire system. The socialist state actually came to rely heavily on this illegal, quasi-capitalist underground network just to keep its citizens fed and content. The second economy acted as an unofficial shock absorber that genuinely generated real value for consumers, but because it operated totally outside the socialist plan, it fundamentally eroded the ideological authority and the legitimacy of the state itself.
Ultimately, as Soviet economists Shmilev and Popov so astutely pointed out, the whole enterprise suffered from a profound overestimation of what central administration could actually achieve. This is the very core of what economists call the calculation problem. Going back to our giant spreadsheet metaphor from the beginning, the millions of daily human decisions, these sudden desires for a different product, the localized emergencies, these simply cannot be fully captured in rows and columns by a centralized committee, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned those planners might be. Without the dynamic, breathing feedback loop of market signals, effectively coordinating a complex, modern society proved to be practically impossible. So, where does this leave us? The Soviet command economy was certainly not random chaos. It was a highly organized, intensely structured system that successfully mobilized an entire nation, transforming an agrarian society into a terrifying industrial superpower capable of winning major wars and launching the first satellites into space. Yet, its ultimate collapse from deep inflexibility, horrible quality issues, and a systemic inability to meet basic consumer demands leaves us with a really critical puzzle to ponder today. How do we best balance our grandest public goals and ambitions with the absolute undeniable necessity of organic, bottom-up economic feedback? Something to think about.